Mind-body duality is one of those questions that humanity has grappled with for thousands and thousands of years. And it is the question that's addressed in Narcissus and Goldmund by Hermann Hesse, which I recently finished. This book was originally published back in 1930, and I read a 1968 English translation by Ursule Molinaro. This book was originally published in English as Death and the Lover, which I thought that was kind of unusual. But Narcissus and Goldmund is the title from the 1968 translation that I read. So, I read this. This is the sixth of the Hesse novels that I've read. I've chatted all the previous 5, so I will link those down in the description below. But I've been wanting to read this one for quite a while, so I'm so glad that I did, because I think this might be my favorite of all of the Hesse novels that I've read. Like I said, it pertains to the notion of mind-body duality. So Hermann Hesse in all of his novels really approaches the idea of duality in different ways and in different forms. In this case, it's mind and body duality. We have Narcissus here representing the mind, and Goldmund, the body, the world of the rational world versus the world of the physical and the senses. So as the story opens, Narcissus is actually a young monk in a monastery. It is the medieval era. It doesn't specify really a location or a year, but we do sort of get from the environment, we understand that it is the medieval era. And he is teaching in this monastery school and is there in the monastery when a man brings his young sort of teenage son, Goldmund, to the monastery to go to the school with the expectation that Goldmund would finish the school and then enter the life of the monastery and spend his life there in the spiritual life in service of the monastery. So Narcissus and Goldmund, Narcissus, they're not that different in age. Goldmund is a student, so he's a bit younger, but not that much. They immediately form a really tight bond, and this bond is enough to cause some talk among the other students and also some of the other monks in the monastery that it might be inappropriate, but in actuality, they just have this really, really tight bond that they form with each other right away. And part of the reason for that is because, I think, they are, between the two, they're kind of opposites. So one would think that they wouldn't, connect with each other. But in a way, they are sort of extreme opposites of each other, so they form a whole. Narcissus being the world of the rational, and Goldmund being the world of the senses. So, Narcissus recognizes right away that Goldmund really, is not really suited for a life in the monastery, a spiritual life. Goldmund doesn't know this because his father's really indoctrinated him, I think, from an early age that this was the expectation, and so this is what he thinks he needs to do and what his future holds. It takes him a while before he realizes what there's something that ends up happening that I won't give away that causes him to understand that he does need to leave the monastery and go on this sort of journey of the senses. And Narcissus understood this right away, and so actually sort of pushes him out of the monastery and out to do this. So Goldmund ends up leaving the monastery and goes for this life of wandering. And so most of the book actually pertains to the journey of Goldmund. We don't circle back again until we get back around to Narcissus until very, very late in the novel. So most of the novel actually pertains to Goldmund's life of wandering out in the world of the senses. So Goldmund doesn't want any kind of ties. He experiences, sort of all of life at its most basic. He's very sexual, so he has multiple relationships with women, and he wanders around. He never stays in any one place for very long, never holds a job, doesn't have very many friends because, like I said, he just leaves. So he has these very brief relationships, but the relationships he does have with people are usually pretty intense, while they last, but then he's just an impermanent being because he's just a wanderer. So eventually he wanders into a church because some things have happened that have caused him, that bother him. I'll just say that. I'm not going to give away what happened. But he decides to go into this church to confess some things that he's done. And he winds up there seeing this very, very beautiful statue, which really gives him an epiphany about art. And so he wants to pursue art. He finds out who the sculptor of this particular statue was, and he goes and seeks to find him. But, he then sort of goes and meets this Master Nicholas, it's called. We learn from Master Nicholas, there's two different characters in this book that we learn sort of pose different paths that Goldmund might take that would be, that would lead him astray in this path of wandering. One of them is Master Nicholas. He sees Master Nicholas as an artist who has become a very successful artist, and so he has a workshop and things like this. Goldmund really finds this really restrictive. He thinks that Master Nicholas, who was a creative genius, has since sort of pinned in and fenced in his creativity to the point that, he's no longer connected with, he calls it the mother, this mother creation, mother figure. So, Goldmund's sort of connected to this mother figure of creativity and the senses, and Narcissus, on the other hand, to the father figure of spirituality, God and spirit and rationality and sort of asceticism. So the sort of the masculine, feminine that principles, especially the mother figure of this spiritual mother, recurs throughout the book. The other character in the book that's sort of a Goldmund that could be is this character Victor, who is a person who's also been a wanderer, who won't be pinned down, but who has been sort of corrupted by it, and it has become really, a kind of a con man, a user, always sort of on the take, and also steals and, is violent and things like this. So we see the dangers of different paths that there's not just this walk of pure of the senses. There are dangers to be had for Goldmund in his wandering. So through the course of the book, does take place in the Middle Ages, like I mentioned, and there is a plague. So the plague, the plague of the Middle Ages ends up happening. And so part of the book actually pertains to Goldmund's wanderings through the countryside during this plague, and Goldmund really understands the impermanence of life, and so he approaches art then as a way to create some form of somewhat permanence, or to capture something of the mother, the creative mother, and put it into a physical form that would last, because he comes to understand that humans, that life, that all life, not just human life, but everything is impermanent. And so there's a quote I wanted to read about impermanence and the mother figure here that I thought was really beautiful. So let me just read that real quick. He says, "A sudden awareness of impermanence washed over him, a feeling that often deeply tortured and intoxicated him. Everything was soon wilted. Every desire quickly exhausted. Nothing remained but bones and dust. But one thing did remain, the eternal mother, basic, ancient, forever young, with her sad, cruel smile of love. Again he saw her for an instant, a giant figure with stars in her hair. Dreamily she sat on the edge of the world, plucking flower after flower, life after life, with a playful hand, slowly dropping them into the bottomless void." I just thought that was so beautiful. This eternal mother with stars in her hair, sitting on the edge of the world, plucking flowers, their lives, and dropping them, because everything is so transient and impermanent. So, yeah, he winds up, Goldmund winds up, he goes and studies under Master Nicholas for a while, and does create some art, but again he can't let go of this wandering life that he has. eventually, he winds up, I won't give away what happens, but he winds up in a bit of trouble. And then we do circle back around and get to meet up with Narcissus again before the book is all said and done. So another quote that I thought that I would read is just about art. And because part of this book, it mostly concerns duality, but there's also an aspect that pertains to art. And what is art? And let me see. Yeah, what is art? And so let me just read this quote real quick about when Goldmund winds up going into a church, and he winds up seeing some statues, and in this church that really move him. And he says, with a sigh, he stepped out through the high portal and saw the silent statues. Angels and saints stand haggard and tall in their stiffly folded gowns, immobile, inaccessible, superhuman, and yet created by the hand and mind of man. Strict and deaf, they stood there in their narrow niches, inaccessible to any request or question, and yet they were an infinite consolation, a triumphant victory over death and despair as they stood in their dignity and beauty, surviving one dying generation of men after another. So this was during that plague, and so there's thousands of people are dying all around, but this art stands sort of eternal. And then at the very sort of at the end, when we meet up with Narcissus again, Narcissus has this to say about art, which I also thought was very moving. And he says, I'm beginning to understand what art is. Formerly, it seemed to me that compared to thinking and science, it could not be taken altogether seriously. I thought something like this: since man is a dubious mixture of mind and matter, since the mind unlocks recognition of the eternal to him, while matter pulls him down and binds him to the transitory, he should strive away from the senses and toward the mind if he wishes to elevate his life and give it meaning. I did pretend, out of habit, to hold art in high esteem, but actually I was arrogant and looked down upon it. Only now do I realize how many paths there are to knowledge, and that the path of the mind is not the only one, and perhaps not even the best one. It is my way, of course, and I'll stay on it, but I see that you, on the opposite road, on the road of the senses, have seized the secret of being just as deeply and can express it in a much more lively fashion than most thinkers are able to do. So Narcissus at the end sort of comes full circle and realizes that there are other ways of being other than the mind, and that there's other way of knowing. There's multiple ways of knowing, and that's a good thing. So yeah, so I'll leave the chat with that. Narcissus and Goldmund really pertains to mind-body duality. There's the differences in, for example, the bead game by Hesse. Our main character is more of the mind. In this case, it's more of the body. In Rosalda, which is another Hesse novel, we do have an artist as well who struggles with this concept of tied down to his art versus free to roam the world and experience the world. So, these themes resonate throughout all the Hesse novels, and he approaches them a little differently in each one. And each one is sort of stands alone in its own thing that it's trying to say, and I enjoyed this very much. So I'll leave the chat with that. My next chat is going to be You Again by Debra Jo Immergut. This is a great synchronicity to read this book following Narcissus and Goldmund, because it sort of pertains to the same thing, where we have an artist who was an artist in her young life, and then now in her middle age, she has sort of what she feels like fenced herself in. So exploring that topic further in this book, You Again by Debra Jo Immergut. I should have a chat on this coming up fairly soon. So until next time, take care. Bye.